It hopped through the village at night. No one dared to speak, because if you made a sound, it would hear you. Welcome to local legends. Today, the Jiangshi, the moon hangs low over the rooftops, pale as bone china, casting the narrow no lanterns burn. The shutters are latched from within, their seams sealed with red paper talismans that flutter slightly in the night breeze. The air smells of earth and incense, of guttering oil and old wood. Somewhere beyond the village boundary, where the rice paddies give way to forest, a dog begins to bark. 3 sharp, frantic yelps, and then falls silent. The silence that follows is absolute. It is the kind of silence that presses against the ears, that makes the heart beat louder in the chest. And then, from the darkness at the end of the lane, comes a sound, a soft, rhythmic thud. Thud, pause, thud, pause. Not the sound of footsteps, something heavier, something that does not walk. The moonlight catches the edge of a figure emerging from the shadows, arms outstretched, stiff as planks. The body moving forward in a grotesque vertical motion, rising and falling with each hop. The fabric of its robes, dark silk embroidered with faded phoenixes, hangs in tatters. Its face, what can be seen of it beneath the wide jan-brimmed hat, is the color of jade left too long in water. The Jiangshi has come. In the southeastern provinces of China, Fujian, Guangdong, Hunan, and the sprawling river deltas, where the Yangtze meets the sea. Death has never been a simple matter of ceasing to breathe. For the people who have lived in these regions for millennia, the boundary between the living and the dead is not a wall, but a membrane, thin and permeable, maintained by ritual, respect, and the proper flow of cosmic energy. The word itself, Jiangshi, is written with 2 characters, Jiangji Feng, meaning stiff, and Shirsh, Fei, meaning corpse, a stiff corpse. But the term carries layers of meaning that no translation fully captures. This is not a zombie in the Western sense, not a mindless plague victim stumbling through streets. Nor is it a vampire, though Western observers would later use that word, drawn by superficial similarities. The hunger for life force, the nocturnal movement, the dread they inspire. The Jiangshi is something older, something rooted in a cosmology that predates the Qing Dynasty, the Ming, even the Great Unification under the first emperor. It is a creature born from the disruption of qi, the vital energy that animates all living things, and from the failure of proper burial rites in a culture where ancestor veneration is not merely religious practice, but the foundation of social order itself. To understand the Jiangshi, one must first understand the geography of death in traditional Chinese thought. The soul, according to classical Taoist and folk Buddhist belief, is not singular but dual. The Hun, the ethereal soul that ascends to heaven, and the Po, the corporeal soul that remains bound to the body and the earth. At death, these 2 aspects must separate cleanly. The Hun rises to join the ancestors in the celestial bureaucracy. The Po gradually dissipates as the body returns to soil. But if this separation is interrupted, if the body is not buried in its native soil, if the death was violent or untimely, if the deceased harbors overwhelming resentment or unfinished business, the Po may refuse to disperse. It clings to the corpse, sustaining a mockery of life through the residual qi trapped in the tissues and bones. The result is a Jiangshi, a body animated not by a soul but by a fragment of earthly energy, driven by a mindless hunger to absorb the qi of the living. The regions where Jiangshi law flourished were places where death often came far from home. In the mountainous interior provinces, laborers and merchants would travel for months, crossing treacherous passes and navigating rivers prone to flooding. In Guangdong, workers migrated to coastal cities, or were contracted to labor in Southeast Asian tin mines and rubber plantations. The Pearl River Delta was a nexus of movement, a place where fortunes were made and lost, where disease and accident claimed thousands, and where bodies piled up far from ancestral burial grounds. For a family, the death of a father or son away from home was not merely a personal tragedy, but a cosmological crisis. Without proper burial in the soil of one's ancestors, Without the rites that would guide the Hun skyward and dissolve the Po into the earth, the deceased risked becoming a wandering ghost. Or worse, a Jiangshi. This fear gave rise to a specialized profession, corpse drivers, or Sheit Feiji Fei, Taoist priests, who made their living transporting the dead back to their home villages for burial. These men would travel at night, leading strings of corpses propped upright on bamboo poles, making the bodies hop along the road to preserve what little qi remained, and prevent full rigor mortis from setting in. Villagers along these routes learned to recognize the sound of the corpse trains, the hollow thud of bodies hitting the ground in rhythm, the jingle of bells the drivers carried to warn the living to stay indoors. Whether these practices were literal or exaggerated over time remains a subject of debate among folklorists, but their influence on Jiangshi mythology is undeniable. The environment that shaped these beliefs was not gentle. The southeastern provinces of China are lands of mist-shrouded mountains, of rivers that flood with catastrophic regularity, of subtropical heat that accelerates decomposition and makes the transport of the dead a race against putrefaction. Rice paddies stretch in terraced cascades up hillsides. Bamboo forests grow so thick that sunlight barely penetrates to the forest floor. In summer, the air is thick enough to taste, saturated with humidity and the scent of growing things and rot. In winter, the mists settle into the valleys and do not lift for days. This is a landscape where the boundary between the living world and the world of spirits feels negotiable, where a wrong turn on a mountain path might lead not to the next village, but to something older and less forgiving. The people who have lived here for generations, Han Chinese, but also Hakka, Yao, and Zhuang communities in the southern highlands, developed elaborate systems of geomancy and ritual to navigate these dangers. Feng Shui dictated not only where the living built their homes, but where the dead would be buried. Taoist priests and Buddhist monks were consulted before any major undertaking. Ancestors were honored with offerings of food, incense, and paper money burned to sustain them in the afterlife. To neglect these practices was to court disaster. The Jiangshi, then, is not merely a monster. It is the physical manifestation of social and spiritual disorder, the consequence of a world where the proper relationships between living and dead, between individual and community, between body and cosmos, have been severed. The appearance of a Jiangshi is unmistakable, burned into the collective memory through centuries of oral tradition, opera performances, and later, film. The creature is dressed in the formal robes of a Qing Dynasty official, long silk garments in dark blue or black, embroidered with dragons or clouds, the kind of attire that signified rank and respectability in life, but which, on a corpse, becomes a grotesque parody. On its head sits a round black hat with a red tassel, the sort worn by minor bureaucrats and provincial magistrates. This choice of clothing is not arbitrary. The Qing Dynasty, which ruled China from 1664to 1692, is remembered in folklore as a time of both rigid social hierarchy and profound upheaval. Manchu conquerors imposing their customs on a Han Chinese population, decades of internal rebellion, the slow encroachment of Western imperialism. The Jiangshi, frozen in Qing Jan-era dress, becomes a symbol of that period's unresolved tensions, a piece of history that refuses to stay buried. The skin of a Jiangshi is described in most accounts as pale, not the pallor of illness, but the greenish Jan white of flesh beginning to decay, tinged with mold or fungus. Some versions describe the skin as covered in a fine layer of white hair or fur, a detail that may derive from observations of actual corpses in advanced stages of decomposition, where fungal growth can create the appearance of downy fuzz. The face is often described as expressionless, the features slack, the eyes either closed or rolled back to show only whites. There is no intelligence in that face, no remnant of the person who once inhabited the body. The mouth, however, is often open, revealing long, sharp teeth, or in some accounts, fangs that protrude over the lower lip. Whether these are exaggerated canines, or simply teeth exposed by the retraction of gums in a decaying corpse, the effect is the same, a face that no longer looks quite human. But the defining characteristic of the Jiangshi, The feature that sets it apart from all other undead creatures is the way it moves. A Jiangshi does not walk. It cannot. Rigor mortis has locked its joints, fusing knees and elbows into rigid poles. Instead, it hops, arms outstretched, stiff and parallel to the ground, legs bound together or moving in unison, the entire body rising and falling with each jump. The sound it makes is distinctive. A heavy thud, followed by a pause, followed by another thud, slow enough that a running person might escape, but relentless, tireless, never stopping, never deviating from its path. The Jiangshi pursues its prey, not with cunning, but with the inexorability of a natural force, like water finding a crack in stone. The creature's primary hunger is for qi, the life force that flows through all living beings. In traditional Chinese medicine and philosophy, qi is not a metaphor, but a literal substance, a form of energy that can be cultivated, depleted, balanced, or stolen. The Jiangshi, animated by a corrupted fragment of this energy, seeks to replenish itself by draining the qi from the living. It does this through direct physical contact, seizing a victim with its rigid arms and either biting them or simply pressing close, allowing the malign Po to siphon away the victim's life force through proximity alone. The victim of such an attack does not die immediately. Instead, they weaken over hours or days, growing pale and lethargic, their own qi gradually depleting until they slip into a coma or death. Some accounts suggest that victims drained of qi may themselves rise as Jiangshi, though this transformation is not universal and depends on the strength of the original creature and the spiritual state of the victim. There are regional variations in how the Jiangshi is conceived. In some versions, particularly those from Fujian province, the creature is capable of a limited form of flight, gliding short distances by channeling residual qi through its limbs. In others, the Jiangshi can sense the living not by sight, for its eyes are often clouded or closed, but by detecting the breath and the sound of a beating heart. This gives rise to one of the most widespread folk prescriptions for avoiding a Jiangshi. Hold your breath and remain perfectly still, without the sound of breathing to guide it. With Tasbai, this detail adds a layer of horror to the legend, transforming the Jiangshi from a general threat into a predator that targets the most vulnerable. Not all Jiangshi are created equal. The strength and malevolence of the creature depend on the circumstances of death and the condition of the corpse. A body that died peacefully, but was simply not buried properly, might become a weak Jiangshi, slow and easily repelled. But a person who died violently, murdered, betrayed, executed unjustly, may rise as a far more dangerous entity, driven by the rage and resentment that fueled their final moments. These powerful Jiangshi are faster, stronger, and more difficult to destroy. Their Po clings to the body with such force that even Taoist rituals may struggle to dislodge it. In some accounts, these creatures retain a fragment of memory, a shadow of their former identity, and may return to the site of their death, or seek out those who wronged them in life. This blurs the line between Jiangshi and another category of Chinese undead, the Yu Fan, or vengeful ghost. While the Yu Fan is incorporeal and operates through possession or psychological torment, the Jiangshi is physical, tangible, and far more directly lethal. Against such a creature, the living are not defenseless. Chinese folk tradition offers a repertoire of protective measures, each rooted in the same cosmological principles that give rise to the Jiangshi itself. The most common defense is glutinous rice, the sticky, short Jian grain rice used in dumplings and festival foods. When scattered on the ground or thrown at a Jiangshi, glutinous rice is said to absorb the malign qi animating the corpse, causing it to weaken or even collapse. The origins of this belief are unclear, but some scholars suggest it derives from the rice's use in funeral offerings and its association with purity and sustenance. Another potent weapon is the blood of a black dog, which must be fresh and painted on door frames or splashed directly onto the Jiangshi. Black dogs are considered spiritually powerful in Chinese folk belief, their presence warding off evil spirits, and their blood capable of disrupting supernatural energy. Mirrors, too, are effective, not because the Jiangshi fears its reflection, but because mirrors are believed to repel negative qi bouncing it back toward its source. The most reliable defense, however, is a Taoist talisman, a strip of yellow paper inscribed with red ink and bearing seals, characters, or diagrams that channel divine authority. These fei, fu, are prepared by trained priests, often during rituals that invoke specific deities or celestial bureaucrats. When affixed to a Jiangshi's forehead, the talisman immobilizes the creature, severing its connection to the Po and reducing it to an inert corpse once more. This image, a hopping corpse frozen mid-gen motion by a paper talisman stuck to its brow, is perhaps the most iconic representation of Jiangshi lore, endlessly reproduced in popular culture. But in the original folk context, the talisman is not a whimsical detail. It represents the intervention of cosmic order, the reassertion of proper hierarchy over the chaos of unregulated death. For those who lack access to a Taoist priest, there are other methods. Breath Jan holding has already been mentioned. Vinegar, strong, Jan smelling herbs like wormwood, and the ringing of bronze bells can also disorient or repel a Jiangshi. Some accounts suggest that the creature cannot cross running water, its connection to the Po being too tied to the earth to traverse rivers or streams. And if all else fails, the ultimate solution is fire. Burn the body completely, scatter the ashes, and the Po will have nothing left to cling to. But this is a last resort, for cremation was historically taboo in traditional Chinese culture, where the integrity of the body was considered essential for the soul's journey in the afterlife. To burn a body was to condemn it to oblivion, and even a Jiangshi, once human, was thought to deserve better. The question of how a person becomes a Jiangshi is inseparable from the question of what a proper death looks like in traditional Chinese culture. Death, in this context, is not merely a biological event, but a transition that requires careful management by the living. The ideal death is one that occurs at home, in old age surrounded by family. The dying person should have the opportunity to settle affairs, to offer final words of wisdom, to see their descendants gathered around them. After death, the body must be washed, dressed in appropriate garments, and placed in a coffin. A funeral ceremony, attended by relatives, and involving the burning of incense and paper offerings, must be conducted by a qualified priest or elder. The body must then be buried in a location determined by geomantic principles, ideally in a family plot or ancestral burial ground. Only then can the Hun ascend and the Po dissolve, completing the cycle. But reality, especially in the turbulent centuries of the late imperial period, rarely conformed to this ideal. Men died far from home, alone and unmourned. Bodies were lost to floods, to banditry, to war. During the White Lotus Rebellion of 1796to1804, or the Taiping Rebellion of 1850to 1864, conflicts that claimed tens of millions of lives, corpses piled up in fields and rivers, unburied and unidentified. Plague and famine swept through villages, overwhelming the living's capacity to perform proper rites. In these circumstances, the risk of Jiangshi proliferated. A body left to rot in an open field, exposed to the elements and scavenged by animals, might retain just enough qi to animate. A person who died with deep grievances, a farmer cheated out of his land, a woman forced into an unwanted marriage, a laborer worked to death in a distant mine, might refuse to let go, their Po clinging to the corpse in a futile attempt to settle scores. There is also the matter of premature burial, a fear that haunted Chinese society as it did many others. In the era before modern medical certification of death, the line between death and deep unconsciousness could be difficult to discern. Cases of catalepsy, coma, or opium overdose might be mistaken for death. A person buried alive, waking in the darkness of a sealed coffin, might claw and struggle until genuine death arrived, and the terror and rage of that final struggle would imprint on the Po, creating the conditions for a particularly vengeful Jiangshi. Some scholars, including Chinese folklorists writing in the early 20th century, have suggested that Jiangshi legends served a practical function. They codified a waiting period before burial, a cultural norm that required families to keep the body in the home for several days, watching for signs of life. The Qing legal code, at various points, mandated such waiting periods, though enforcement was inconsistent. Whether these laws were inspired by Jiangshi legends or vice versa is a question that may never be definitively answered, but the relationship between the two is clear. Another pathway to becoming a Jiangshi involves the interruption of the corpse's journey. As mentioned, corpse drivers were hired to transport bodies across long distances, a process that could take weeks. If the corpse driver was incompetent, if he failed to perform the nightly rituals that kept the Po quiescent, or if he lost control of the corpse train due to accident or attack, the bodies under his care might reanimate mid-journey. There are folk tales of entire strings of corpses breaking free and hopping off into the wilderness, terrorizing travelers and villagers until a more capable priest could be summoned to subdue them. In these stories, the corpse driver is often portrayed as a tragic figure, a man doing a necessary but deeply unpleasant job, haunted by the knowledge that a single mistake could unleash catastrophe. Finally, there is the matter of sorcery. Some traditions hold that a Jiangshi can be deliberately created by a malicious magician or Taoist priest who has turned from the righteous path. By performing inverted rituals, by inscribing the wrong characters on talismans, by trapping the Po within the corpse. Instead of releasing it, such a sorcerer could animate a body and command it to carry out his will. These sorcerers and controlled Jiangshi are particularly feared, for they combine the mindless hunger of the creature with the cunning and intent of a human master. They might be sent to assassinate an enemy, to steal valuable goods, or simply to sow terror in a rival's village. In these accounts, the Jiangshi becomes a weapon, a tool of human evil, rather than a natural consequence of cosmic disorder. The cosmological implications of the Jiangshi extend beyond individual tragedy. In traditional Chinese thought, the universe operates on principles of balance, yin and yang, heaven and earth, life and death. These forces are not opposed but complementary, each defining and sustaining the other. Death is not the enemy of life, but its necessary counterpart. And the dead, when properly honored, become allies of the living, ancestors who watch over their descendants, who intercede with higher powers, who lend their wisdom and blessings. But when death is mishandled, when bodies are not returned to the soil, when rites are not performed, the balance tips. The dead become a burden rather than a blessing. The Po, instead of dissolving, festers, and the Jiangshi, stiff, pale, hopping through the night, becomes a symptom of a world where the natural order has been violated. This is why Jiangshi are often framed not as evil in themselves, but as tragic. They are victims, in a sense, of circumstances beyond their control. The person they once were is gone. What remains is a residue, a mistake, an echo that should have faded but did not. To destroy a Jiangshi is an act of mercy as much as self-Jan defense. To prevent one from arising is an act of filial piety, a responsibility that falls on the living. The legend then functions as both warning and instruction. Honor your dead, bury them properly, and never let ambition or poverty or haste lead you to neglect the rituals that keep the boundary between life and death intact. When the first European missionaries, traders, and colonial administrators arrived in southeastern China in the 17th and 18th centuries, they brought with them their own frameworks for understanding the strange and the supernatural. These frameworks were shaped by Christian theology, by Enlightenment rationalism, and by centuries of European folklore concerning the undead. The result was a series of mistranslations and misinterpretations that would fundamentally reshape how the Jiangshi was understood outside of China, and, eventually, influence how it was understood within China as well. The Jesuit missionaries who established themselves in coastal cities like Guangzhou and Macau were among the first to document Chinese folk beliefs in Western languages. Their accounts, written in Latin, French, and Italian, were intended for European audiences, hungry for tales of the exotic East. But the Jesuits were also engaged in a theological project. They sought to identify parallels between Chinese philosophy and Christianity, to find common ground that might facilitate conversion. Death and the afterlife were central to this project. The Jesuits noted the Chinese emphasis on ancestor veneration and drew comparisons to the Catholic veneration of saints. They noted the Taoist priest's role in mediating between the living and the dead, and compared him to the Catholic priest. But when confronted with Jiangshi law, the Jesuits struggled. As a creature that did not fit neatly into Christian demonology, it was, in the most literal sense, a body without a spirit, a concept that sat uneasily within a theological tradition that held body and soul to be inseparable, except by divine intervention. In their reports, the Jesuits tended to describe the Jiangshi as a form of necromancy, a corpse animated by sorcery, and thus evidence of the power of demons in heathen lands. This framing was not entirely inaccurate, but it stripped the legend of its cosmological context. Where the Chinese saw disrupted qi and the failure of ritual, the Jesuits saw diabolical intervention. This interpretive gap would persist for centuries, coloring Western accounts of Chinese folklore well into the modern era. By the 19th century, as the Qing Dynasty weakened under the pressure of internal rebellion and external imperialism, European and American observers arrived in China in increasing numbers. Merchants, diplomats, missionaries, and journalists fanned out across the empire. Reports that ranged from the scholarly to the sensational. De Groot, whose monumental 6-den volume work The Religious System of China, published between 1888 and 1891, remains one of the most comprehensive Western studies of Chinese folk religion. De Groot devoted considerable attention to funeral practices, ancestor worship, and beliefs about the dead. He described the Jiangshi, though not always by that name, noting the widespread fear of corpses that had not been properly buried, and the elaborate rituals employed to prevent them from rising. De Groot's tone was generally respectful, avoiding the more lurid exaggerations common in popular journalism. But even he could not entirely escape the Orientalist lens that framed Chinese beliefs as curiosities rather than as coherent systems of thought. The term Chinese vampire began to appear in English Den language publications around the turn of the 20th century, coined by translators and journalists who sought a familiar referent for Western readers. The comparison was superficial. Unlike the European vampire, the Jiangshi does not drink blood. It absorbs qi. It does not seduce its victims. It hunts them with mindless hunger. It cannot shapeshift command animals, or entrance the living with hypnotic gazes. It does not fear garlic or crosses, or running water in quite the same way. But the label stuck, and with it came a set of associations that had little to do with the original Chinese legend. Western popular culture, increasingly fascinated with vampire mythology in the wake of Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1888, was eager to absorb any vaguely similar creature from other cultures. The Jiangshi, rebranded as a vampire, entered the global imagination, but in a distorted form. During the Republican era, from 1888 to 1889, Chinese intellectuals grappling with the country's tumultuous modernization began to re-evaluate their own folklore. The May 4th movement of 1889, which called for the rejection of Confucian tradition and the embrace of science and democracy, included a critical stance towards superstition. Jiangshi legends, along with ghost stories and tales of fox spirits, were dismissed by progressive intellectuals as remnants of feudal ignorance, obstacles to national progress. Yet even as the educated elite turned away from these stories, they remained vital in rural areas and among working Dan class communities. The corpse drivers continued their trade, or claimed to at least, well into the 1890s. Taoist priests still performed exorcisms and protective rituals. The Jiangshi, far from vanishing, adapted, its image shifting to reflect the anxieties of a new age. One notable Western account from this period comes from British colonial officer and amateur folklorist Bertram Lennox Simpson, who published under the pen name B. L. Putnam Whale. In his 1889 book Indiscreet Letters from Peking, Simpson recounted second-hand stories of corpse trains passing through northern Chinese villages during the Boxer Rebellion of 1889. Simpson's account is tinged with skepticism. He suggests that the corpses were likely opium smugglers traveling in disguise, but his willingness to record the tales at all speaks to their persistence. Whether factual or apocryphal, such stories found eager audiences in both China and the West, feeding into a broader fascination with the macabre and the supernatural that characterized the early 20th century. The communist victory in 1896 and the establishment of the People's Republic of China marked another shift. The new government, committed to scientific materialism and the eradication of feudal remnants, launched campaigns against folk religion. Temples were closed, priests were persecuted, and traditional rituals were banned. The Jiangshi, as a subject of serious belief, was driven further underground. But it did not disappear. Instead, it migrated to new media, print fiction, comic books, and eventually film. In Hong Kong, which remained a British colony until 1996, filmmakers found creative freedom that did not exist on the mainland. It was there, in the bustling studios of Shaw Brothers and Golden Harvest, that the Jiangshi would undergo its most dramatic transformation, and where it would, paradoxically, reach its widest audience. The documented history of Jiangshi encounters is, by its nature, difficult to disentangle from folklore. Unlike cryptids such as Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster, which are purported to be living animals, and thus theoretically susceptible to zoological documentation, the Jiangshi is supernatural by definition. It cannot be captured, tagged, or studied in a laboratory. Nevertheless, Chinese historical records, legal documents, and local chronicles contain numerous accounts that treat Jiangshi incidents as factual events, recorded with the same bureaucratic matter of factness as floods, bandit attacks, or bumper harvests. One of the earliest documented references appears in the Ziji Tongjian, or Comprehensive Mirror in Aid of Governance, an 11th Jian century historical chronicle compiled by the Qing Dynasty scholar Sima Guang. The text references incidents from earlier periods, including a passage describing corpses rising from mass graves during a famine in the later Han period. 3rd century, the corpses, according to the account, wandered the countryside, stiff, Jian-limbed and pale, attacking travelers and villagers. Local magistrates organized militia to burn the bodies and cleanse the area with salt and lime. While the term Jiangshi is not used, the terminology would standardize later. The description matches closely. Whether these were actual reanimated corpses, plague victims mistaken for dead, or starving refugees whose desperate appearance gave rise to supernatural fears, the record treats the event as real and worthy of official response. During the Qing Dynasty, references to Jiangshi become more frequent and more specific. Provincial records from Guangdong note several incidents in the late 1800s involving corpses that rose from their coffins during transport. In one case, dated to 1800, a corpse driver named Chen Lao was transporting 3 bodies from Guangzhou to a village in the interior when one of the corpses broke free from its bindings and attacked him. Chen managed to affix a talisman to the corpse's forehead, immobilizing it, but not before suffering deep scratches on his arms. The local magistrate's report, preserved in the archives of Guangdong province, describes the incident in clinical detail, including a description of the corpse's appearance. Pale as jade, limbs rigid, mouth agape, eyes clouded. The magistrate ordered the body burned, and the ashes scattered, and commended Chen for his quick thinking. Whether Chen's story was genuine or fabricated to excuse some mishap during transport, the magistrate's acceptance of the explanation reveals the cultural plausibility of Jiangshi incidents in that time and place. Another well-documented case comes from Hunan province in Shizhou. According to records maintained by a local temple, a series of deaths occurred in the village of Shaping over the course of several weeks. Victims, all healthy adults, fell ill suddenly, with no apparent cause, growing progressively weaker until they died. Survivors reported seeing a pale figure hopping through the village at night. A Taoist priest was summoned from the provincial capital and conducted an investigation. He traced the incidents to a recently buried corpse, a merchant who had died while staying at the village inn, far from his home. The priest exhumed the body and found it in an abnormal state. Flesh still pliable, skin unrotted, eyes half-Jian open. He performed a ritual, inscribed talismans on the coffin, and had the body reburied with additional safeguards. The deaths stopped. The temple record includes the priest's name, Xuan Lingzi, and the date of the ritual, Mei Shici, Shizhou. A particularly detailed account comes from the early 20th century, recorded by the folklorist and novelist Pu Songling in his posthumously published collection Liaocai Jiayi, or Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio. While most of Pu's stories are fictional, they are framed as oral histories gathered from travelers and villagers, and some may have roots in actual events. One tale describes a man named Wang, who encounters a Jiangshi on a mountain path. The creature, dressed in tattered official robes, blocks Wang's way, hopping slowly toward him. Wang freezes, holding his breath, and the Jiangshi passes within inches, apparently unable to detect him. Wang later learns that the corpse had been a minor official who died of illness while traveling, and whose body was abandoned by his servants. The description Piu provides is consistent with other Jiangshi lore: stiff limbs, outstretched arms, a hopping gait, pale skin, and a lack of visible intelligence. Whether Wang was a real person or a composite character, the story's detail suggests familiarity with the legend's canonical traits. In the modern era, Jiangshi sightings have become rarer, at least in terms of documented reports. The spread of scientific education, the decline of corpse driving as a profession, and the shift toward cremation, especially in urban areas, have reduced the social and environmental conditions that gave rise to Jiangshi beliefs. However, anecdotal reports persist, particularly in rural areas of Guangdong, Fujian, and Hunan. In the Yitenjiu Baizishimao during the Cultural Revolution, a Red Guard publication from Guangdong included a denunciation of feudal superstition that referenced recent rumors of a Jiangshi in a remote village. The article was intended as propaganda, mocking the villagers for their backwardness, but it confirms that such stories were still circulating even during a period of intense ideological repression. One case from the Yitenjiu Baibashimaus gained some attention in Hong Kong newspapers. In Yitenjiu Baibashisen, a man named Liang Sheng, working as a caretaker at a cemetery near Guangzhou, reported encountering a hopping corpse while making his rounds at night. Liang described the figure as wearing old Jian-style clothing, moving in the characteristic Jiangshi manner, and emitting a foul odor. He fled and returned the next morning with several colleagues, but they found no trace of the creature. Liang's account was published in a local tabloid, where it was treated as a curiosity rather than a serious news story. Skeptics suggested that Liang had encountered a grave robber or a vagrant dressed in stolen burial clothes, while believers pointed to his detailed description and obvious terror as evidence of a genuine encounter. The case was never officially investigated. It is worth noting that the standards of evidence for Jiangshi reports differ significantly from those applied to cryptid sightings in Western contexts. In the West, a Bigfoot or Mothman sighting might be accompanied by photographs, footprint casts, or hair samples. Physical evidence, however, ambiguous. Jiangshi encounters, by contrast, are almost never accompanied by such evidence. The creature is understood to be supernatural, and thus not subject to the same rules as natural phenomena. A photograph of a Jiangshi, if such a thing existed, would not be accepted as proof by skeptics, because the very premise assumes the breakdown of naturalistic explanation. What matters, in the cultural logic of the legend, is not whether the Jiangshi can be proven, but whether the encounter conforms to the expected pattern. The hopping gait, the pale skin, the timing and location, the victim's symptoms. The absence of physical evidence is not seen as a flaw, but as consistent with the creature's nature. There is also the matter of mistaken identity and medical misdiagnosis. Several modern researchers have suggested that historical Jiangshi reports may have been cases of catalepsy, catatonia, or neurological conditions that caused the appearance of death, followed by unexpected movement. A person buried alive, and later escaping from a shallow grave, disoriented and traumatized, might indeed hop or stumble in a stiff, Jian-limbed manner, especially if suffering from oxygen deprivation or injury. The greenish pallor could be a result of lividity, fungal infection, or exposure to the elements. The reports of victims being drained of qi might correspond to diseases such as cholera or tuberculosis, which cause rapid wasting and debilitation. This does not explain away the Jiangshi legend so much as illustrate how folk beliefs can arise from the misinterpretation of real, if poorly understood, phenomena. The legend becomes a narrative framework through which a community makes sense of the inexplicable. Finally, it is important to acknowledge the role of hoaxes and theatrical performances. In rural China, traveling opera troupes and street performers have long staged Jiangshi scenes as entertainment. Actors in full costume, their faces painted white, would hop through town squares, chased by mock Taoist priests waving talismans, to the delight of audiences. These performances were understood as fiction, but they reinforced the visual and behavioral template of the Jiangshi. In some cases, Pranksters or criminals might have exploited this familiarity, dressing as Jiangshi to scare travelers or cover their movements. One anecdote from the Yitenjiubai Ashimao describes a gang of opium smugglers who, when confronted by police, pretended to be corpses being transported by a corpse driver. The ruse worked long enough for them to escape, suggesting that even officials steeped in the same cultural context could not easily distinguish between the supernatural and the mundane when faced with the unexpected. The Jiangshi might have remained a purely regional legend, known only to scholars of Chinese folklore and Chinese diaspora communities, had it not been for the explosion of Hong Kong cinema in the Yitenjiubai Bashamaus. The territory, a British colony perched on the edge of mainland China, had developed a robust film industry that drew on Chinese opera traditions, martial arts choreography, and Western genre conventions. Hong Kong filmmakers excelled at hybridity, at blending the local and the global, the traditional and the modern. And in Yitenjiubai Bashawu, a film was released that would transform the Jiangshi from a subject of folk belief into a pop culture phenomenon, Vampire, directed by Ricky Lau. Mr. Vampire tells the story of a Taoist priest, Cao, who runs a funeral home and moonlights as an exorcist. When a wealthy family hires him to relocate their grandfather's grave, according to feng shui principles, Cao discovers that the corpse has transformed into a Jiangshi. What follows is a blend of horror, comedy, and martial arts, as Cao and his bumbling assistants attempt to subdue the creature using traditional methods, sticky rice, talismans, and breath gen holding. The film's Jiangshi, portrayed by actor Yuan Hua, is a near-gen perfect visual embodiment of the folklore. Qing Dynasty robes, a black hat, pale makeup, arms outstretched, hopping in slow, menacing rhythm. The creature is terrifying, but also oddly comic, its stiff movements and single-gen-minded hunger lending it a slapstick quality that undercuts pure horror. Mr. Vampire was a massive commercial success, not only in Hong Kong but across East and Southeast Asia. It spawned 4 direct sequels, numerous imitators, and established the Jiangshi as a staple of Hong Kong cinema throughout the late Yitenjiubai Bashamas and early Yitenjiubai Joshamaus. Films like Encounters of the Spooky Kind, Yitenjiubai Basha, predating Mr. Vampire but less influential, the musical Vampire, Yitenjiubai Josha, and Magic Cop, Yitenjiubai Josha, all featured Jiangshi prominently, each adding new twists to the formula. The genre became known as Jiangshi Pian, or Jiangshi films, and for a time, it seemed that no Hong Kong studio could resist producing one. What these films did was both preserve and distort the original legend. On one hand, they popularized the Jiangshi's iconography, the costume, the hopping, the talismans, ensuring that even people with no direct connection to Chinese folk tradition would recognize the creature. On the other hand, they simplified and standardized the mythology. The complex cosmology of Qi, Hun, and Po was reduced to a few throwaway lines of dialogue. The somber ritual of corpse driving became a setup for action sequences. The Jiangshi itself, once a tragic figure symbolizing the failure of social and spiritual order, became a monster to be defeated, often played for laughs. The films were entertainment, not ethnography, and they made no pretense otherwise. Yet their influence was profound. For a generation of viewers in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and among the Chinese diaspora, these films became the definitive reference point for Jiangshi lore, often superseding the oral traditions and folk beliefs that preceded them. The Jiangshi also found its way into literature and comics, particularly in Hong Kong and Taiwan. Manhua, or Chinese comics, in the Yitenjiubai Bashamas and Yitenjiubai Joshamao frequently featured Jiangshi as antagonists, or, occasionally, as reluctant allies. One notable example is the long-gen running series, The Blood Sword by Hong Kong artist Tony Wong, which incorporated elements of wuxia martial arts, fantasy, and horror, including a storyline involving a clan of Jiangshi controlled by a rogue sorcerer. In Japan, the Jiangshi was adapted into manga and anime, where it became known as Kionsh Fei 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 Fei, a phonetic rendering of the Cantonese pronunciation. The character Hsien Jian Ko from the video game series Darkstalkers, introduced in 1994, is a Jiangshi designed in the Hong Kong film aesthetic. Paper talisman on her forehead, traditional robes, supernatural abilities. Her inclusion in a fighting game developed by Capcom, a Japanese company, illustrates the creature's migration across cultural and national boundaries. Western audiences encountered the Jiangshi primarily through these Hong Kong films, often in dubbed or subtitled versions circulated via video rental stores, and late Gen night cable television in the 1994. The creature was usually referred to in English as a Chinese vampire, or hopping vampire. Translations that emphasized the exotic and the comical. Reviewers in English Gen language publications often struggled to take the films seriously, focusing on the perceived absurdity of a hopping monster, rather than the cultural context from which it emerged. This reception was not entirely unfair. The films themselves often leaned into absurdity, embracing camp and slapstick. But it reinforced a perception of the Jiangshi as kitsch, rather than as a legitimate subject of folklore. In the 21st century, the Jiangshi has experienced a modest resurgence in global pop culture, though often in altered forms. The creature appears in video games such as Sleeping Dogs, Liancening Yisha, set in Hong Kong, and the Dark Pictures anthology, Man of Medan, Liancening Yisha, which includes a cursed ship with Jiangshi, Zan-like corpses. In the animated series Avatar, The Last Airbender, the character of Ko the Face Stealer draws partial inspiration from Jiangshi lore, particularly the emphasis on stillness and breath control. The Liancening Yisha Chinese, Jian Hong Kong Ko, Jian production Rigor Mortis, directed by Juno Mack, attempted to revive the Jiangshi film genre with a darker, more serious tone, stripping away the comedy and returning to the creature's roots in mortality and grief. The film was a critical success, but a commercial disappointment, suggesting that audiences had moved on from the genre's heyday. Perhaps most intriguingly, the Jiangshi has begun to appear in discussions of representation and cultural appropriation. As global media has become more interconnected, there is growing awareness of how folklore from non-Zen Western cultures is adapted, often clumsily by Western creators. The Jiangshi, with its specific cosmological and cultural baggage, resists easy assimilation into Western genre conventions. It is not quite a zombie, not quite a vampire, not quite a ghost. Attempts to westernize it, its Taoist rituals, the Qing Dynasty costumes, the hopping. This has led some Chinese and Chinese diaspora creators to reclaim the legend, producing works that emphasize its roots in Chinese philosophy and history. The Jiangshi, in this context, becomes not just a monster, but a symbol of cultural specificity, a reminder that not all folklore is universal and that some stories lose their meaning when translated too freely. Yet for all its transformations, the Jiangshi retains a core resonance. In an age of globalized death, where bodies are routinely embalmed, cremated, or shipped across continents, where traditional rituals are abandoned in favor of efficiency, the Jiangshi speaks to anxieties about what we owe the dead. It asks, what happens when we forget where we came from? What happens when the dead are not honored, not returned to the soil, not given the rites that ease their passage? These are not questions that modernity has resolved. If anything, they have become more urgent. The Jiangshi, hopping through the night in its tattered robes, is a reminder of debts unpaid, of relationships severed, of the consequences of treating death as mere disposal. In Liancening Yisha, a team of Chinese anthropologists from Sun Yat-sen University in Guangzhou published a paper examining the persistence of Jiangshi beliefs in rural communities. Their research, conducted over 3 years in remote villages in Hunan and Guangdong, found that while the literal belief in reanimated corpses has largely faded, the cultural logic that underpins it remains strong. Elderly villagers still insist on burial over cremation, despite government incentives to the contrary. Families still hire Taoist priests to perform protective rituals when a death occurs far from home. And when asked directly about Jiangshi, respondents did not dismiss the concept outright, but framed it in conditional terms. It could happen if the rites are not done correctly. We don't take chances. This suggests that the Jiangshi as a literal entity may be dying, a victim of urbanization, secularization, and the spread of scientific rationalism, but as a metaphor, as a narrative structure for articulating fears about death, dislocation, and the erosion of tradition, it is very much alive. The Jiangshi is what happens when the dead are not allowed to rest, when the living neglect their responsibilities, when the connections that bind community and cosmos are severed. In this sense, the legend is less about corpses and more about consequences. It is a story about what we leave behind and what refuses to stay buried. Consider the context of contemporary China, a nation that has undergone transformations in the span of a century that other societies took millennia to navigate. The economic reforms that began in the late 1990s have pulled hundreds of millions of people out of rural poverty and into urban centers. Cities have grown at a staggering pace. Farmland has been paved over for factories and high-rise apartments, ancestral villages. Once the center of life and identity, are emptying out, left to the elderly and the very young, while the working age population migrates to Shenzhen, Shanghai, Beijing. The physical graves of ancestors, once tended with care, visited regularly, maintained as sacred sites, are now often neglected, sometimes even bulldozed for development projects. The traditional rituals that governed death have been compressed, commodified. Funerals that once took days and required the participation of the entire community are now completed in hours at state-run crematoria. For those who remember the old ways, this is a source of profound unease. The Jiangshi, in this light, becomes a metaphor for the return of the repressed. It is the past that refuses to stay in the past, the tradition that hops into the present demanding recognition. It is the grandfather whose grave was moved without proper ceremony, the ancestor whose name is no longer spoken, the ritual that was skipped because everyone was too busy, too modern, too rational. The creature's relentless hopping, its inability to rest, mirrors the psychological state of a society caught between worlds, no longer fully rooted in tradition, but not entirely comfortable with the alternative. This metaphor extends beyond China. In the global context, the Jiangshi can be seen as an emblem of cultural dislocation for Chinese diaspora communities, particularly those whose families left during periods of upheaval. The Cultural Revolution, the Hong Kong handover, the waves of emigration to North America and Southeast Asia. The question of where the dead belong is fraught. Bodies cannot always be returned to ancestral lands. Graves are scattered across continents. Traditional rituals are performed imperfectly or not at all, remembered in fragments by generations who were born far from the villages their grandparents knew. The Jiangshi, in this context, is a figure of exile, a body that cannot find its way home. Its stiffness, its frozen posture, its repetitive hopping, these are the physical manifestations of being stuck, of being unable to complete a journey, of existing in a perpetual state of not quite here and not quite there. And then there is the environmental reading. The Jiangshi arises when the dead are improperly disposed of, when they are left to rot in the open or buried in the wrong soil, in an era of ecological crisis, when the earth itself is being poisoned and degraded, when industrial agriculture depletes the soil and urban sprawl obliterates ecosystems. The Jiangshi can be seen as a symbol of environmental desecration. It is the land refusing to accept what we have done to it. The toxins leaching back into the water, the consequences of treating the earth as a dumping ground rather than a sacred trust. The Jiangshi's hunger for qi, for life force, mirrors the extractive logic of capitalism, which drains the vitality from landscapes, communities, and individuals in pursuit of endless growth. The creature, in this reading, is not a monster, but a symptom, a visible manifestation of invisible damage. Perhaps most compellingly, the Jiangshi speaks to the terror of being forgotten. In traditional Chinese culture, the greatest misfortune is not death itself, but the failure to be remembered, to have no descendants to burn incense, no one to speak your name, no marker to show where you are buried. This is why ancestor veneration is not sentimental but existential. It is the mechanism by which the dead remain part of the living community, A Jiangshi, by definition, is a corpse that has been forgotten, abandoned, left to fend for itself in the liminal space between death and dissolution. Its hopping is a desperate attempt to be seen, to force the living to acknowledge its existence. In an age where anonymity is increasingly the norm, where people die alone in apartments, where the elderly are warehoused in nursing homes, where community bonds are frayed, the Jiangshi is a figure of profound loneliness. It is the nightmare of dying unmourned, of being erased. And so the legend endures, adapting to new contexts, finding new meanings. The Jiangshi may no longer hop through village lanes in the hills of Hunan, but it hops through the collective imagination, a reminder that some debts cannot be cancelled, some memories cannot be repressed, some traditions cannot be discarded without consequence. It is a creature of the threshold, eternally caught between what was and what is, unable to move forward but refusing to lie down. In its stiff, hopping form, we see reflected our own struggles with change, with loss, with the impossible task of honoring the past while living in the present. The Jiangshi asks, what do we owe the dead? And perhaps more urgently, what will happen if we do not pay? The question hangs in the air like mist over a rice paddy at dawn, unanswered. In the distance, if you listen closely, you might hear it. A soft, rhythmic thud. Thud, pause. Thud, pause. Something is coming, something that does not walk. And when it arrives, it will demand what is owed. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more folklore, myths, and mysterious creatures. See you next time.